Are we depending on God's mercy, or are we functioning in His blessing? When we work out our own strategies and initiatives, when we work it out in our strength, and then we expect God to bless, we're actually depending on His mercy. And God is merciful. But there is something better. In any situation, when we truly go to God for direction, when we rely on His leading, when we respond to Him, we get a very different outcome. We see God's blessing. We see His power released. We see God, as is His nature, do something greater. We see God take it to a whole nother level. Now, in candor, I've done it backwards more times than I care to contemplate. We have this great disconnect that we say we trust God and we rely on Him, but our first response seems to be to work it out ourselves. And only when things are really overwhelming do we truly rely on Him. And in doing it that way, we never know what might have been, what God might have done. And we see that in King Asa. So he starts out great. He's trying to honor God, trying to follow God. And the day comes when the word comes of this overwhelming threat, this vast army coming to attack him. Now, some translations say as much as 1 million men are coming to attack him. Regardless, this vast army is an overwhelming problem, an overwhelming challenge. Now, the good news is it was beyond his ability to deal with. So how does he respond? He goes to God and says, this is too big for us. There's nothing we can do. And there's no one we trust but you to save us, to give us the victory. And the short version is God does give them the victory. In fact, God does, as is His nature, takes what's an overwhelming problem, an overwhelming challenge, and turns it into an overwhelming blessing. Then what happens? That vast army is not just defeated, but then Asa and the army carry away this massive blessing. They carry away this vast plunder. They get the loot. That literally the outcome God gave them was not just victory, but a massive blessing that went with it. And God sends word to Asa and says, simply, as long as you're with me, I'm with you. And they had this long period of peace and prosperity. But then there came eventually another challenge, actually a smaller challenge. The king of Israel has declared war on him, and he starts building this fortress on this key road. And so Asa looks at what's in his hand, what's at his disposal, and he takes the gold and the silver from the temple and sends it to the king of Syria asking for an alliance. Now, at a superficial level, this strategy seems successful. That this strategy of working it out himself, what he had at his disposal, seems to work because the king of Syria agrees. He attacks Israel. Israel withdraws. And Asa and his army tears down this fortress and with the building materials built 2 towns. It seemed to be a successful strategy. But what might have been? What was it God might have done if they had relied on Him? Because the word comes where God says, because you relied on the king of Syria rather than on me, the king of Syria's army escaped from you. Hang on. It sounds a bit like instead of being allies, God wanted to give Asa dominance over the Syrians. We'll never know. And God goes on and says, what happened? You had this vast army and you relied on me and I gave you the victory. And then God goes on and says something profound for all of us. He says that His eyes roam the earth to and fro, looking for those whose hearts are loyal to Him, that He may show Himself strong on their behalf. In any situation, that is God's nature, that when we're looking to Him, He's looking to show Himself strong on our behalf. But we have this disconnect, and we rely on ourselves. And in doing so, we never know when we've done it ourselves what might have been. David was promised, anointed to be the king. But there was that season of preparation when he's on the run from Saul. And while so often he did rely on God, we see instances where he worked it out himself. Now, one of those was he's on the run from Saul, and he goes to the priests asking for food and any weapons they might have for him and his men. And the priest asks, why are you here? And David says he's on the king's business. Now, the reality is he's lying. I've heard people try to justify it by saying, oh, God was the king, he's on God's business. No. Let's not try to justify things. The reality was he lied. And a consequence was that Saul, when he found out that the priest had helped David, killed the priest. And David acknowledged it was his fault because he worked it out in his initiative. And then he's hiding in Gath, and he finds out that, oh, you know what, I may have worn out my welcome here. Now, does he go to God and say, what do I do? No. He actually pretends to be insane. He pretends to be crazy. He's got drool running down his face until they drive him out. What might have been? Maybe David started to realize what might have been, because right after that, he wrote Psalms 34, which proclaims the faithfulness of God towards those who put their trust in Him. So at a practical level, how do we for ourselves retrain ourselves that are, as much as possible, our first response is not to look at what's at our disposal, how do we attack this, how do we respond, but rather that our first response is literally, God, what's your plan? And just as important, how do we train those that we lead? How do we train those that we're responsible for? Help develop in them a new pattern of reliance on God so that we find out and we see God at work. We get something greater.